Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our history stories. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's uncover a chilling chapter from Missouri's past, Thornhill Asylum's horrifying past, revealed asterisk. The year was 1889, and Missouri was a land of sprawling forests, quiet towns, and secrets buried beneath layers of ordinary life. In the heart of rural Missouri, nestled atop a cold, wind-swept hill, stood Thornhill Asylum, a massive brick structure with iron-barred windows that gleamed like watchful eyes in the sunlight. The locals whispered about the place, as though speaking its name aloud could invite its shadows into one's home. Thornhill wasn't just a hospital. It was a place where fear lived, where desperation took form, and where the line between life and death blurred in ways no outsider could comprehend. Thornhill Asylum had opened its doors in the spring of 1887, a product of a growing concern in America for the mentally ill. But the state of Missouri, though well-meaning, was unprepared for what it would encounter. At first glance, Thornhill seemed orderly. Doctors in crisp white coats walked the long corridors. Nurses moved swiftly, attending to patients with mechanical efficiency. Families brought their loved ones here with hope, believing that science and care could mend minds frayed by trauma, grief, or illness. Yet within months, the asylum revealed a darker truth, one that would haunt Missouri for decades. The patients were unlike anything the townsfolk had seen. Some were children who wandered the streets, talking to invisible friends. Others were adults whose minds had fractured under the weight of grief or misfortune. The asylum's records spoke of hundreds of souls, all seeking relief, all seeking understanding. But what they found instead was confinement, harsh discipline, and a daily life that teetered between routine and chaos. The wards were overcrowded, and the staff, though trained, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Men and women, sometimes stripped of dignity and privacy, moved like shadows through narrow hallways, their cries muffled by thick brick walls. Dr. Edwin Thornhill, the asylum's founder and namesake, had grand visions of reform. He had studied mental health in the East, visited institutions in New York and Pennsylvania, and believed that Missouri could pioneer compassionate treatment for the insane. But ambition, as history often proves, does not always align with reality. Funds were limited, public oversight was minimal, and the pressures of running a large institution soon eroded Dr. Thornhill's idealism. The wards became crowded, meals were rationed, and punishments, subtle at first, began to escalate. Patients who wandered beyond their assigned areas were restrained. Those who spoke out of turn were isolated. The very tools meant to heal order, discipline, and observation became instruments of terror. Among the earliest patients was a young woman named Clara Whitmore. Clara had been admitted after the death of her husband in a tragic accident, her mind unraveling under grief she could not contain. At Thornhill, she encountered a world unlike anything she had known. The nurses, though technically skilled, were cold and distant. The hallways echoed with the sounds of anguish, the moans of men confined in solitary rooms, the frantic scratching of fingernails against cell walls, the clatter of metal chains restraining those who had become too wild to manage. Clara's own fear became a shadow that grew inside her, a companion she could not escape. And yet, she was not alone in her suffering. All around her were faces etched with despair, eyes vacant yet burning with silent pleas for mercy. Stories of strange occurrences began to circulate almost immediately. Some patients spoke of hearing voices in empty corridors, of seeing figures in the corners of rooms that vanished when approached. Nurses reported that doors locked themselves, that lights flickered without cause, and that certain rooms, especially the East Wing, carried an unnatural chill even on the hottest Missouri summer days. No one dared linger there, yet the administrators insisted all reports were simply stress or hysteria, the natural byproducts of a population unwell in mind and body. But locals, visiting family members, swore that Thornhill was alive in a way that no building should ever be. Its very walls seemed to watch, judging, punishing, and absorbing the pain within. Despite the fear, Thornhill expanded. By 1890, its capacity had doubled. Patients filled every room, every bed, every corner. And with the growth came tragedy. Typhoid, influenza, and other illnesses spread rapidly among patients who lived in close quarters. The hospital's staff, exhausted and overworked, struggled to maintain even the basic standards of hygiene. Patients died quietly in their beds, sometimes alone, sometimes bound in restraints, their families never informed until weeks later. Dr. Thornhill himself walked the halls in silence, his vision of a progressive asylum crumbling into something more reminiscent of a penitentiary than a hospital. Yet, within the despair, small glimmers of humanity persisted. Some nurses, in secret, offered comfort a hand to hold, a whispered word of reassurance, a stolen piece of bread for the hungry. Patients formed bonds, holding on to one another for warmth, for hope, for sanity. Clara, in particular, found a quiet friend in a man named Samuel, a former schoolteacher whose mind had cracked under the strain of financial ruin. Together, they would whisper stories to one another in the night, clinging to memories of the outside world, memories of freedom that seemed a lifetime away. The most horrifying aspect of Thornhill, however, was not the disease, nor even the neglect. It was the methods used to control the patients. The asylum employed what were considered modern treatments at the time: electrotherapy, cold baths, and isolation in padded cells. These practices, though intended to calm or restore, often resulted in trauma, sometimes permanent. Reports spoke of patients screaming for days after treatments, of their minds fraying further rather than healing. Families, desperate for answers, were met with vague reassurances or outright lies. Those who questioned the practices risked removal from the grounds or the dismissal of their concerns, as ignorance. Word of Thornhill's horrors gradually leaked beyond Missouri. Journalists, drawn by rumors of malpractice and mistreatment, attempted to gain access, but the asylum's doors remained tightly shut. The town surrounding Thornhill treated it with a mixture of fear and fascination. Children dared each other to approach the iron gates, only to flee screaming at shadows that seemed alive. Adults avoided the hill, their conversations quick and hushed whenever the asylum's name surfaced. Thornhill had become both a landmark and a warning, a place where ambition and humanity had collided with tragic consequences. And so, the story of Thornhill Asylum began, not with a bang, but with whispers of suffering, whispers of lives confined, and whispers of a building that seemed to breathe the fears of those within. Clara Whitmore's tale, though personal, reflected the larger reality of the institution, that in a place meant to heal, pain had become the most enduring resident. By the end of that first decade, Thornhill had earned a reputation not merely as a hospital, but as a monument to human fragility, to ambition gone awry, and to the dark undercurrents of a society still learning how to care for its most vulnerable. Yet the shadows had only begun to deepen. The 1890s would bring new patients, new tragedies, and stories so unsettling that even the bravest of townsfolk would whisper of Thornhill with an edge of fear in their voice. Clara and Samuel, though small lights in the darkness, were about to witness horrors that would forever change their understanding of suffering, control, and the fragility of the human mind. And as the wind howled through the gnarled trees surrounding Thornhill, the asylum seemed to listen, as though it knew that its story was just beginning, and that its most horrifying chapters were yet to come. The dawn of the 1890s brought a strange stillness over Thornhill Asylum. On the surface, the institution appeared unchanged. Brick walls stood firm, chimneys puffed gentle streams of smoke, and the long corridors echoed with the familiar shuffle of staff and patients. But beneath that calm, the atmosphere thickened with dread, as though the building itself had absorbed the anguish of its residents and refused to release it. The patients who arrived during this period carried with them stories of trauma that only deepened the shadows inside Thornhill. Men and women, once vigorous, were now gaunt and hollow-eyed, their expressions frozen somewhere between fear and resignation. Clara Whitmore and Samuel moved cautiously through the wards, their bond growing stronger, but so too did the sense that something unnatural had settled over the hill dot. It was during the winter of 1891 that Thornhill's darker practices began to escalate. The hospital administration, under increasing pressure to maintain control over an ever-growing patient population, implemented stricter measures. Restraints became more common. Padded cells were used not just for moments of crisis, but as prolonged punishment, and the treatments intended to heal frequently became instruments of torment. Electrotherapy, once experimental and rare, was now routine, and the cold baths, immersion in ice-cold water for hours at a time, left patients shivering, delirious, and in some cases, permanently damaged. Staff argued among themselves, some expressing unease at the methods, others insisting it was the only way to restore order. But in the corridors, the screams of those subjected to these measures painted a grim reality far from the comforting vision of care that families had imagined. Clara witnessed horrors that seemed almost too cruel for words. One morning she entered the East Wing to find a young boy, no older than 12, bound to a chair, shivering uncontrollably, his eyes wide with terror. The boy had been brought in after a brief episode of what doctors described as fits of hysteria, but his only crime, it seemed, had been the inability to conform to the strict routines of Thornhill. Clara's heart ached, yet she knew speaking out would accomplish little. The administration dismissed such incidents as necessary discipline. Samuel, ever her confidant, whispered that the building itself seemed to encourage cruelty, as though the asylum's very bricks had absorbed the anguish of past patients and now demanded more suffering. Patients began to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Some were quietly transferred to other institutions, though records were scarce, incomplete, or deliberately falsified. Others were confined to isolation chambers for weeks at a time, their absence unnoticed except for the occasional muffled cry echoing through the halls. Rumors among the staff suggested that a few patients had died during treatments, but official reports cited natural causes. Families received vague letters, or in some tragic cases, no communication at all. Fear took hold not just of the patients, but of anyone associated with Thornhill, creating an invisible chain of silence that bound the community as tightly as the chains on the wards dot. It was in this climate of terror that Clara began to notice something else, a pattern, subtle yet unmistakable, in the disappearances and unexplained events. Certain rooms, always in the same wing, seemed to absorb sound. Voices that should have carried through the hallways vanished within these walls, as if swallowed by some unseen force. Patients who entered these rooms often returned different, some quieter, others more erratic, and a few, like the boy Clara had seen, traumatized beyond recognition. Nurses, when questioned, would look away, murmuring excuses about sensitive patients or accidents of care. But Clara, intuitive and desperate for understanding, began to suspect that something far more sinister was at work than the documented treatments or overwork of staff. The administration continued to expand. By 1892, new wings had been added, increasing the asylum's capacity by nearly a third. These wings, however, were designed with efficiency in mind, not comfort. Long, narrow hallways stretched like tunnels of despair. Rooms were stacked tightly together, with barred windows that allowed only glimpses of the outside world, and doors that clanged shut with a finality that seemed almost ceremonial. The East Wing, the most notorious among staff and patients alike, was where the most troublesome individuals were placed. Few entered willingly, and even fewer returned unchanged. Whispers among the residents suggested that shadows moved in those corridors, shadows that were not human, shadows that watched and waited for moments of weakness. One evening, Clara and Otto, Samuel discovered a hidden ledger tucked beneath the floorboards of the nurse's station, a record of treatments, punishments, and unexplained deaths. The names, some familiar, some unknown, were accompanied by chilling notes. Removed for observation, subject unresponsive isolated, died during therapy, no family notified. The ledger confirmed what they had long feared. Thornhill was a place where the suffering of its patients was meticulously documented, yet systematically ignored. The more Clara read, the heavier the weight of hopelessness settled upon her chest. Yet within her, a spark of determination grew. If the building could inflict this much pain, perhaps understanding its methods, its secrets, could be the first step toward resistance, toward salvation. By 1893, the asylum had become a microcosm of human suffering. Children wandered the halls, their small hands gripping the rails, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Adults, many of whom had once held jobs or families, now shuffled aimlessly, their minds tethered to past traumas, yet trapped within the strict confines of Thornhill. The staff, increasingly desensitized to the daily horrors, treated these patients as little more than cases or numbers. Yet there remained pockets of quiet defiance moments where compassion flickered in the darkness. Clara and Samuel became clandestine allies to some, smuggling food, offering comfort, and speaking words of hope that might otherwise have been extinguished. Stories began to leak beyond Thornhill's walls. Families who had long accepted the institution's reassurances started to speak of neglect and cruelty. Local newspapers hinted at abuses, though they were careful to avoid direct accusation. Word of the asylum's practices spread, and fear took root in the surrounding towns. Children dared not approach the hill, and even adults felt a chill in the air when they passed the iron gates. Thornhill was no longer merely a hospital. It had become a symbol of human frailty, a place where ambition, neglect, and cruelty intersected to create a living nightmare. And yet, for all the horror, Thornhill Asylum continued to operate, funded by the state, shielded by bureaucracy, and defended by those who believed in its mission. Patients remained inside its walls, their cries muted but persistent, their suffering etched into the fabric of the institution. Clara and Samuel, though small lights in an overwhelming darkness, held on to each other, knowing that survival required not only endurance, but courage. The horrors of Thornhill were far from over. The coming years would bring new patients, each with their own stories of trauma and despair. Treatments would grow harsher, records would become more secretive, and the building itself would seem to pulse with a malevolent energy. What had started as a place of healing had become a monument to suffering, and the hill upon which Thornhill stood seemed to grow darker with each passing year. As the wind howled through the skeletal trees surrounding the asylum, carrying with it the cries of the unseen, Clara whispered to Samuel that they had to endure, that they had to find a way to survive this place. Little did they know, survival would demand more than courage. It would demand confrontation with the very heart of Thornhill's darkness. And as night fell over Missouri, the asylum seemed to breathe in anticipation, as though aware that its most chilling chapter was still unfolding. By the mid-1890s, Thornhill Asylum had become a place of whispered terror, a hilltop prison of flesh and mind, its reputation creeping into every Missouri town within a day's ride. Patients no longer merely suffered from the tragedies that had brought them here. They suffered from the institution itself. Those walls, once thought to shelter the mentally ill, had become instruments of oppression, carrying stories of despair that no official record would ever fully capture. And yet, the asylum continued to expand, driven by a society eager to fix its broken, even as it ignored the human cost of its ambition. Inside, the East Wing had grown more ominous. The rumors circulating among staff and patients were no longer mere whispers. They had become a chilling reality. In this wing, patients deemed too difficult were subjected to procedures that skirted the very edge of morality. Electrotherapy. Machines crackled in dimly lit rooms, their wires and metal clamps intimidating even the most seasoned staff. Cold baths, once a form of shock therapy, now lasted for hours, leaving patients trembling, delirious, and in some cases, slipping from life into death unnoticed. Clara, having witnessed these treatments firsthand, felt her stomach churn with a mix of horror and helplessness. Samuel, too, had begun to fear that survival alone was no longer enough. They needed knowledge, strategy, and perhaps a measure of luck to endure. It was during this period that the asylum's most secretive experiments came to light. Thornhill's administrators, eager to make the hospital a model of modern treatment, had begun testing unconventional therapies, often on patients who could not consent. The staff recorded their findings meticulously, as if scientific documentation could justify acts that, in truth, were cruel and arbitrary. Patients were strapped into chairs for hours at a time, their senses overwhelmed by bright lights, deafening sounds, or sudden temperature changes. Some emerged catatonic, others screamed for days. Clara and Samuel, witnessing these horrors in secret, began to understand that Thornhill's darkness was not just a product of neglect or overcrowding. It was deliberate, systematic, and terrifyingly calculated. Yet the human spirit persisted. Even amidst the torment, Clara found ways to offer solace. She whispered stories to the children, recounting memories of warm summers, family picnics, and songs that once carried through the streets of Missouri towns. Samuel, with his quiet courage, guided patients through hallways, ensuring that those who could walk did so without attracting the ire of overworked nurses or cruel overseers. Small acts of kindness became lifelines, fragile threads connecting individuals to the hope that the world outside the asylum still existed. And yet, those threads were constantly threatened by the pervasive cruelty of Thornhill itself. The most harrowing experiences occurred in what staff referred to as the observation rooms. These small, windowless chambers were designed for patients deemed volatile or uncooperative. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional wail or plea for mercy. Patients were left alone for days, sometimes weeks, their only company the shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls like living fingers. Clara had once been led to one of these rooms by accident, and the memory haunted her for months. The smell of dampness and fear, the cold that seemed to seep into her bones, the sensation that the walls themselves were closing in. Samuel, ever pragmatic, avoided these rooms whenever possible, but they were an unavoidable reality for anyone at Thornhill. Outside the walls, the town had begun to notice the growing unease. Families who once trusted the institution now whispered of irregularities, missing relatives, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths. Letters from the asylum were vague, dismissive, and often arrived too late. Some townsfolk, emboldened by outrage, attempted to investigate, only to be met with bureaucratic stonewalling. The state, eager to protect Thornhill as a model institution, often disregarded complaints, labeling critics as uninformed or hysterical. But fear of the asylum's reputation, combined with a growing sense of helplessness, kept most from speaking out too loudly. Thornhill's shadow stretched far beyond its brick walls, silencing voices before they could reach the public dot inside. The patients' lives had become a cycle of torment and fleeting relief. Meals were monotonous and meager. Beds were hard, often shared with those whose movements made rest impossible. Those who tried to escape or resist were punished severely, sometimes with prolonged isolation, sometimes with treatments that left permanent scars. The very structure of Thornhill seemed designed to strip away autonomy, leaving individuals vulnerable to despair. Clara and Samuel, however, discovered hidden networks within the asylum patients who had learned to communicate through small gestures, secret notes, and the faintest of signals. These networks became lifelines, ways to maintain a sense of identity in a place that sought to erase it. One particularly chilling event occurred when a fire broke out in one of the newer wings. Though no one was killed, the smoke and chaos revealed the asylum's fatal flaws. Hallways were narrow, exits were limited, and staff struggled to evacuate patients. Clara and Samuel helped guide children to safety, their courage saving lives even as the flames highlighted the fragility of Thornhill's systems. In the aftermath, administrators promised reforms, but these were little more than superficial adjustments. The core of the institution, the overcrowding, the harsh treatments, the isolation, remained unchanged, and the patient's suffering continued, largely hidden from the world outside. By 1895, Thornhill Asylum's reputation had solidified as a place of darkness and despair. The building itself seemed almost alive, a living entity that absorbed pain and exhaled fear. Patients moved like shadows within its walls, some resigned, some terrified, some quietly plotting ways to endure. Clara and Samuel had become essential figures offering comfort, courage, and companionship. Yet they knew that survival required more than care. It required vigilance, intelligence, and an understanding of the asylum's rhythms. The whispers of the past patients who had come and gone, some forgotten, some still alive, haunted the hallways. Some spoke of ghostly figures, voices in empty corridors, and the weight of unseen eyes. Others simply endured in silence, their minds clinging to fragments of memories, songs, and stories from the world beyond Thornhill. For Clara and Samuel, the asylum had become more than a place of confinement. It was a test of human endurance, a stage on which courage, compassion, and resilience were the only tools capable of withstanding the oppressive darkness. And as Missouri's seasons shifted, bringing cold winters and sweltering summers, Thornhill Asylum continued its relentless operation. Patients arrived daily, lives were broken daily, and the institution's grim purpose remained steadfast. Yet, within this overwhelming darkness, Clara and Samuel's efforts reminded everyone that even in the most horrifying of circumstances, hope could survive, even if just as a flickering flame. But the asylum had one final, most terrifying chapter, yet to unfold one that would test not just the patients, but the very conscience of Missouri itself, forcing everyone to confront the full scope of Thornhill's horrifying past. This concludes Part 3, where the darkest practices, secret experiments, and extreme psychological torment at Thornhill are fully explored, building toward the ultimate climax. If you're ready, I can now write Part 4, the final part, revealing the asylum's most shocking secrets, the consequences for staff and patients, and the lasting legacy of Thornhill on Missouri history. By the late 1890s, Thornhill Asylum had become a place that few dared to speak of outside the walls. Yet its horrors were no longer a secret entirely confined to whispers. Families, journalists, and even some officials had begun piecing together fragments of the truth. Patients who survived the East Wing returned with haunted eyes, their memories fragmented by trauma. Clara Whitmore and Samuel had become not just observers of suffering, but active participants in a quiet rebellion, small acts of defiance that aimed to preserve humanity in a place that sought to erase it. But even they could not anticipate the culmination of Thornhill's dark legacy. It began with the arrival of a new superintendent, Dr. Cornelius Hawley, a man whose reputation for strict adherence to experimental methods rivaled that of Thornhill's founder. Dr. Hall brought with him a vision for reform through innovation, though his innovations often carried an air of menace. He increased the use of isolation chambers, refined electrotherapy into more prolonged and aggressive sessions, and experimented with drugs whose effects on the human mind were largely untested. Patients were frequently subdued with sedatives, then observed as if they were subjects in a controlled experiment rather than human beings. The asylum became a theater of control, with each corridor and room carefully engineered to maintain order, but at an unimaginable human cost. One day, Clara discovered the fate of a young woman named Evelyn, a patient who had arrived after a severe nervous breakdown. Evelyn's screams had echoed through the East Wing for weeks before she vanished without explanation. Following a lead from the hidden ledger they had found years earlier, Clara traced Evelyn's disappearance to a previously unknown basement wing, a section of Thornhill that even most staff were reluctant to enter. The rooms there were damp, cold, and windowless, lined with chains and reinforced beds designed to immobilize. Evelyn, like many before her, had been used in experiments intended to study the mind under duress. Clara's discovery revealed a chilling truth. Thornhill was not merely negligent. It had evolved into a laboratory of suffering, a place where morality had been deliberately set aside in the pursuit of power and knowledge. Samuel, deeply troubled by Clara's discovery, helped her document the conditions in secret. Together, they recorded the cruel treatments, the hidden wings, and the horrifying effects on the patients. They realized that their survival, and perhaps the survival of anyone who had been brought here, depended on exposing Thornhill. But even as they planned, the asylum seemed aware, as if the building itself conspired to keep its darkest secrets hidden. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the corridors. Cries echoed from empty rooms, and staff who appeared cooperative sometimes turned suspiciously watchful, their loyalties divided between duty and fear. In the midst of this growing tension, the patients began to exhibit unexpected resilience. Children formed small, clandestine groups to warn one another of dangerous areas. Adults shared memories of the outside world to keep hope alive. Clara and Samuel became central figures in this quiet resistance, using coded messages, small gifts, and whispered advice to help patients navigate the asylum's treacherous environment. It was a dangerous game, and discovery could result in severe punishment, yet the human spirit proved stubbornly enduring. Even in the face of extreme cruelty, bonds were formed that could not be broken by chains, isolation, or fear. The turning point came in 1897, when a particularly severe storm struck Missouri. Torrential rains and gusting winds battered Thornhill, flooding lower wings and straining the asylum's infrastructure. In the chaos, several of the basement chambers filled with water, and patients trapped in those rooms cried out in terror. Staff scrambled to rescue them, but the storm revealed the structural vulnerabilities that had long been ignored. This calamity provided an opportunity. Clara and Samuel coordinated a desperate effort to document and preserve evidence of the worst abuses, knowing that once the storm passed, administrators would attempt to cover the truth. Their work captured the unimaginable conditions: starvation, neglect, experimental cruelty, and the silent suffering of hundreds of patients over the years. By the time the storm subsided, the public had begun to demand answers. Families who had long suspected the asylum's abuses pressed for investigations. Journalists arrived, armed with letters, accounts, and crucially, the documentation that Clara and Samuel had collected. State officials could no longer ignore the growing outcry. Investigations confirmed what many had feared: Thornhill Asylum had systematically mistreated, isolated, and experimented upon patients for over a decade. Staff members who had once participated without question were held accountable, though the records of disciplinary action remained frustratingly incomplete. Dr. Hall and some of the senior administrators faced scrutiny, but the full scale of the suffering proved difficult to convey in official reports. Yet the story of Thornhill was not simply one of punishment or justice. It was also a testament to survival and resilience. Clara Whitmore, Samuel, and countless patients emerged with lives irrevocably altered, yet with memories that preserved the humanity the asylum had tried to destroy. Survivors recounted their experiences in town meetings, letters, and memoirs, warning future generations of the dangers of unchecked authority, neglect, and the dehumanization of the vulnerable. Thornhill, though physically intact, became a cautionary monument, a reminder that institutions can fail tragically when compassion is overshadowed by control. Over the years, Thornhill was eventually restructured. Wards were redesigned, patient numbers limited, and oversight increased. The east wing and basement chambers, where so much suffering had occurred, were closed permanently. Yet the legacy of the asylum lingered, both in the minds of its former patients and in the folklore of Missouri towns. Locals spoke of lingering shadows, ghostly cries at night, and the inexplicable chill that hovered around the hill long after. The institution had reformed. Clara and Samuel, having survived the worst of Thornhill, dedicated themselves to advocacy. They worked with other survivors to improve care for the mentally ill, sharing their harrowing experiences to ensure that history would not repeat itself. Their courage, forged in the crucible of suffering, became a beacon of hope for those who had once been silenced. The story of Thornhill Asylum, horrifying as it was, became a lesson in resilience, morality, and the enduring need for compassion in the treatment of humanity's most vulnerable. Even today, the hill on which Thornhill stands carries the weight of its past. Tourists, historians, and locals alike feel a subtle unease when approaching its gates. For those who know its history, the asylum is not just a building, but a reminder of human fragility, institutional failure, and the power of endurance. Cries of the past may no longer echo through the corridors, but their memory endures, shaping the conscience of Missouri and the broader American understanding of mental health care. In the end, Thornhill Asylum's story is not merely one of horror. It is a story of lives tested and spirits strengthened, of humanity confronted with its darkest tendencies, and of courage emerging in even the bleakest circumstances. It is a story that demands remembrance, a story that continues to haunt, not for the fear it inspires, but for the lessons it imparts. And as the wind brushes across the hilltop, carrying faint echoes of cries long silenced, one cannot help but feel the weight of history, the shadows of suffering, and the quiet triumph of those who survived.